Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Using Racial Equity Tools to Build Organizational Equity with Jordan Bingham, Colleen Butler, and Angela Russell. This is Tom Banke with Forward Community Investments, and we're excited to have you join us for today's presentation. Before we get going, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some background on how we got here today. Forward Community Investments has been serving the state of Wisconsin for over 20 years. FCI transforms Wisconsin communities by supporting organizations and programs that reduce racial, social, and economic disparities. Our mission is to be an investor, connector, and advisor for organizations and initiatives that reduce social, racial, and economic disparities in Wisconsin communities. Our vision is an equitable and inclusive Wisconsin that is built on cooperative social action. With the help of BMO Harris Bank, we are able to offer this series of webinars to provide partners with tools and approaches that can be used to advance racial equity within their work at no cost to you. BMO Harris Bank is an active partner in Wisconsin communities and demonstrates strong corporate citizenship as an important part of who they are and how they approach community. Volunteerism and corporate responsibility are a key part of the culture at BMO Harris Bank. It's how they demonstrate their commitment to and investment in the communities they serve. At this point, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping slides with regards to the program GoToWebinar. You can join the webinar by using the telephone number provided in the email that you had received when you registered. If you are experiencing issues with the audio through your computer speakers, we would recommend that you use a landline telephone for optimum sound. We do ask that if you are on your phone, please use the mute function so we do not pick up any unwanted noise. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and we'll be taking questions during the webinar. You can submit them using the chat or questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. At this point, we'd like to have everyone participate in the first poll of the webinar. We will be asking a few of these throughout the presentation, so we want to make sure that we get the first one out of the way and everybody understands how to use it. I'm going to launch this first poll here. What is your role within the organization? You will see a pop-up there, so go ahead and respond with the your role, I guess. And we're seeing some folks, some answers trickling in right now. The majority of them are staff. The options: executive director, board member, staff, funder, and other. We have representation from all factions, so that's good. How about that?
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Great. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. So I'll share those responses. We've got, like I said, a little bit, 2/3 staff, and then, some executive director representation, board members, funders, and others. So great. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. Now we'd like to use the chat feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Please enter your name and the organization of which you are representing. So we'll wait for those to come through, and I'm getting some of those come through here. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today and kind of setting the stage here. Now that we've got those tasks out of the way, let's get to know our speakers. Jordan Bingham has over a decade of experience as a leader, educator, and facilitator in the areas of public health and racial justice. As Health Equity Coordinator at Public Health Madison and Dane County and part of the leadership team of the City of Madison's Racial Equity and Social Initiative, she serves in leadership roles in local and national initiatives aimed at advancing health and racial equity in government and community. Colleen Butler is the Racial Justice Director at the YWCA of Madison. She has been facilitating racial justice workshops for over 15 years, during which time she has also presented at conferences and developed Train the Trainer programs. She chairs the Dane County Equal Opportunities Commission and was a member of the Dane County Task Force to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system in 2009, which produced over 80 recommendations for Dane County to begin to reduce racial disparities in our criminal justice system. While under her leadership, the YWCA Madison was recognized by the YWCA USA with the Association Excellence Award for Racial Justice. Angela Russell, as the Community Manager of Diversity and Inclusion at CUNA Mutual Group in Madison, Angela is working to create healthy communities and ensure that everyone has the opportunity to live up to their fullest potential. She is continuously learning and working to integrate the practices of mindfulness, compassion, and kindness. In this webinar, participants will learn about the specific tools and processes that can be used to embed equitable and inclusive practices in day-to-day work of an organization or institution. The presenters will share some examples from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, highlighting an evaluative process to ensure equity in public policy, internal policies, and within hiring practices. At this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Jordan, Colleen, and Angela and launch our second poll question of the afternoon.
Okay. So, are we ready?
We are.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This is Jordan Bingham, and I'm going to be starting us off, and wanted to start off with a poll question because we wanted to get a sense of your level of familiarity with racial equity tools. So the poll question says, have you used or participated in a project where racial equity tools were used? And again, that's just to give us a sense of the level of experience and familiarity people might have.
Sure, and we're getting those results come in as we speak. It's pretty split, evenly between yes, no, and a little less unsure. Okay. So it looks like there's some common ground and some places to explore a little bit. So okay. I'll get that, and then I will go ahead and we'll make sure that you guys are able to adjust your... Okay, I'll come over here, please. Over here. Okay. Well, looks like we're having some technical difficulties here, but we'll go ahead and we'll have, bear with me, I apologize for this, but we are good to go here. And just from this one.
Okay.
Then you can use the arrows and the spacebar.
Okay, nothing if not flexible. All right, so for my portion, and again, this is Jordan, I'm going to be talking about setting the stage with just a little bit of framework and context around what racial equity tools are, why you might use them, some scenarios in which we've used them, and some things to think about whether or not you have experience with using racial equity tools, just some ways of approaching the use of racial equity tools and how we see them fitting within a larger context of doing racial equity work. And I guess before I get started, I would just say that we take a pretty expansive view and definition of what racial equity tools are. I can talk about the tools that the City of Madison has developed, but know that there are lots of tools out there and they can be used in a huge variety of different ways. And really, I think what's most important, again, is the sort of the thinking and the strategy that goes in with those, which is what I'm going to try to cover today. So what are racial equity tools? As you can see, this is sort of one of the definitions that we use, an explicit and systematic examination of ways in which communities of color and other marginalized groups would likely be affected by a decision, including policies, practices, programs, and budgets. And really, for us, in the tools that we use, the tools are essentially a set of questions that cause us to do what we like to refer to as an intentional pause to make sure that we're thinking about some of the considerations that we might not be thinking about, and just because sometimes the way our routine ways of doing business, as we know, may be contributing to or perpetuating racialized inequities. And of course, I can probably speak for all of us, certainly not our intention, but sometimes can be the outcome. So we want to think about the different choice points that you have in your decision-making processes. And so as we said, they can be used in policies, practices, programs, budgets, and really can be used at different points in a process. And we'll talk about what some of those points are. But what I want to make sure to mention is that developing and using racial equity tools should never be an end unto itself. It's great to use racial equity tools, but if if your goal is to be applying a racial equity tool to be checking a box or to be, putting another layer on a project, that's not really what we're going for. So we want to think about different choice points and having real clarity about what you're trying to accomplish. Otherwise, using the tools isn't going to make much of a difference. And so an example that's been on my mind a lot lately is the idea of raising the minimum wage. And that's a topic that's being discussed in a lot of places right now. There's actually action going on in a variety of states and cities and counties around the country on raising the minimum wage. And sometimes it gets talked about as though that's the outcome that we're trying to get to, when really I would argue that raising the minimum wage isn't the outcome we're trying to get to, but creating better opportunities and better quality of life for people to be able to support themselves and their families is the outcome that we're trying to get to. So adding that layer of analysis might allow us to have a better conversation about what it is that we're really trying to accomplish. I think oftentimes we jump right to solutions instead of taking that step back and looking at what is the problem we're actually trying to solve. So in the case of raising minimum wage, using a racial equity analysis might allow you to identify some potential unintended consequences, like if somebody starts making a higher wage, they may no longer be eligible for assistance programs for housing or food or other types of assistance that they were accessing before. There might be unintended consequences for small business owners and so on. And so what a racial equity analysis can do is allow you to make better informed decisions and say, maybe the recommendation after the analysis is, yes, do raise the minimum wage, and also maybe do a graduated implementation or consider graduated levels of eligibility for assistance programs that exist. So those are some things to think about. And really, when we think about our routine decision making, knowing that every decision we make every day, large or small, does have an impact on racial equity and potentially perpetuates racialized inequities, even if there's not an intention. And when we think about policy making and planning, there's never truly a race-neutral policy, especially when we focus on what the outcomes are. So wanted to share a few examples of some racial equity tools that exist. As I mentioned, the City of Madison does have tools that our racial equity and social justice team created, and there are a lot of other ones out there. So here's one that's from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a national network of cities and counties working to advance racial equity in local government. And this is available online at racialequityalliance.org. As you can see at the bottom, a lot of other cities and counties are using this as a template for their racial equity tools. There's an organization that operates out of Chicago, New York, and Oakland called Race Forward, and they were one of the first organizations, I think, that started talking about racial equity impact assessments, and several cities and organizations have modeled their tools after Race Forward. The City of Seattle is a place that we've looked strongly for guidance. In fact, I was just reflecting that 3 years ago, Colleen was able to learn about Seattle's use of racial equity tools and came back and shared that information with some folks from the city, and that was a major catalyst for getting our work started. And so we've learned a lot from the City of Seattle, and they've used their toolkit really widely. And then the last one that I'll share is from Multnomah County in Oregon, and they've used their tool called the Equity and Empowerment Lens, and is used to build both organizational capacity and also aid policy and program decision making. And in all of these places, I just want to point out that the use of racial equity tools is not done in isolation. And again, it goes back to that having your end in mind and your vision of the transformation that you are looking for. So knowing that just using racial equity tools in isolation has the tendency to be very transactional as opposed to transformative. And so just want to point that out, that the use of these tools should be accompanied by a vision of organizational transformation, of continued learning, training, continued work to diversify staff and leadership, which my colleagues here will talk a little bit more about, and to continue to work to, in all of our organizations, identify institutional racism and bias and work toward continued improvement and centering of racial equity in all of our goals and our work plans and budgets. And that, again, just racial equity tools are only a part of that work, and that's been our approach that we've tried to put forward in Madison and Dane County. this may go a little bit without saying, but did just want to point out some of the reasons why you might consider using a racial equity tool. So you might want to, if you become aware of racialized inequities, if you're looking at your data and you don't like what you see, trying to identify what some of those root causes are and getting what we would call getting upstream to try to identify what's really going on there and get to some deeper solutions. Understanding and interrupting inequitable impacts of what you're currently doing, so related to that, and then identifying and minimizing unintended burdens or consequences of new policies or programs that you might be developing, and then ensuring that the voices of those who are most impacted are heard. So we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating our culture of white dominance or inequitable use of power unintentionally, and make sure that we are including those who in the day-to-day our decisions are actually going to impact. And so we know, in government, for us, we have to be really clear about the fact that government at all levels has been responsible for creating and perpetuating racialized inequities, and that it's not just our, we don't only have the ability to interrupt that, but we have the responsibility to do that. And again, looking back over our history at a wide range of laws and policies that have been passed, including everything from who could vote, who could be a citizen, who could own property, who was property, where you can live, who could own land, and so on. And so despite some progress from the civil rights movement up to now, including making acts of discrimination illegal, we know that deep and persistent inequities exist across all indicators, including health, which is my area, education, criminal justice, jobs, housing, public infrastructure, transportation, and more. So we have to make sure that our current patterns and systems stop sustaining those old legacies and start being more intentional about undoing them and continuing to do better. So I want to pause and incorporate another poll question. So thinking about your work, what decisions, projects, or policies are coming to mind for you, or have you thought about before, that could benefit from the use of a racial equity analysis? And some of the examples that we thought of are your strategic plans or work plans, a specific project, your HR hiring policies, budgets, public policy or legislation, the way that you work with suppliers or contractors.
Great, thank you so much and for participating in this. We're gathering the results as of right now. The majority, I would say, more than half would be the strategic plan or work plan, and some HR policies seem to be the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So are we good there?
Mm-hmm.
All right. We can actually share the results with you of what we have tabulated. You can kind of see over there in kind of a bar graph form. And then we'll get back here, and then we'll go from there.
Great, thanks. And thanks to all of you. That's pretty consistent with what we've seen in the city. We're aware of at least 20 different projects and ways in which our racial equity tools have been used, and including examples from all of these. And so be happy to share some of those examples. And if we have time, I'll get to one in a little bit more detail in just a little bit. So the next question is, who should use racial equity tools? Who are they there for? And the simple answer is anybody can, and most of us should. And so that can go from elected officials, can include government staff, and also businesses and organizations. And we also believe that the use of racial equity tools can be community driven, and that has actually played out a couple times in local government here, where there have been specific projects or proposals on the table for development or so on that community members have actually asked, suggested, and requested the use of racial equity tools being incorporated into city decision making. And I think as a part of the racial equity work from within government, I'm all for that. I think that should be a partnership that gets further developed too. So really anybody can use them, and the ways in which they might be used could vary a little bit depending on the type of organizations or fields or sectors that you're in. When should equity tools be used? They work well in the development of new policies, plans, budgets, and partnerships, and also in the evaluation of existing ones. So if you want to find out, if you've got something that's been going on for a while, you want to find out what the impacts of that policy or program and so on might be, you can evaluate in the kind of the spirit of quality improvement. And again, can also be used in developing new ones. And we do recommend that the application of a racial equity analysis be done as early as possible in the process, but that's not a deal breaker. And so, if you've got something that's a little ways down the road, wouldn't discourage you from using racial equity tools. In fact, I'll use an example of the public health department where I work. We're actually engaged in a strategic planning process that's been done over the course of several months, and we found multiple points in that process where racial equity tools can be used. And what it does is facilitates input from staff and stakeholders to make sure that people are contributing and that multiple voices are being heard. And you can see some examples there. There are several examples. Like I said, the city has used these tools over 20 times. You're going to hear some specific examples in a minute from Colleen and Angela. We've used the tools on everything from hiring and promotion decisions to city ordinances and legislation, to looking at some of our operations from trash pickup to animal licensing. The public market process has incorporated the use of racial equity tools. The fire department has used them on planning its next fire station. And we're looking at how to incorporate racial equity tools more in a more systematic way in development decisions, in city plans, in outcome-based budgeting, and in the way that we do community engagement. And that's just to name a few examples. So as I mentioned, racial equity tools are essentially just a set of questions, and they are designed to help us get a better look at a more holistic view of our decision making. And the reality is sometimes there's not enough time, or sometimes there's not quite enough institutional buy-in, and we understand that, to do a full-on analysis. So one of our solutions to that has been, we have two different versions of our racial equity analysis tool, a comprehensive and a fast-track version, because we know that sometimes we don't have enough time to do the deep level of engagement and input that we would like to do, but we still do want to put that lens on, so to speak. And so at the very least, we would recommend that you just carry these two questions around in your head all the time. Who would benefit or be burdened by this decision, and what are the potential unintended consequences? And if we can start incorporating those questions into our thinking, into our day-to-day choice points in a systematic way or in a routine way, we think that our outcomes can be better across the board. So don't be daunted by not having enough time or thinking that the process is complicated. So for the rest of my time before I hand off, I want to just talk really quickly about what would the process be, how it should look when you do incorporate a racial equity analysis, and then I'll give just a quick case study example. And so this is from modified from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So first, do start with a clear description of the policy, program, and decision at hand. Make sure you're not jumping to solutions right away. So what is it that you're, and I guess that goes into number two then, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? What do you want to see as your intended result and outcome? Do try to look at what data you have on hand and what data might be missing. And then if you are using data, let's say it's your workforce data, are you able to disaggregate that by race and other demographic factors? Engage your stakeholders. Get input from those who are going to be affected. So we like to say that the use of racial equity tools is only as good as the variety of perspectives that are involved. So do make sure that you make intentional efforts to get as many perspectives involved as possible. And then you get into the analysis. So that's where you get to the questions. Walk through those questions with your group, and then that's where you start to get to solutions and strategies. Once you have your realm of solutions and strategies identified, figure out what's feasible, what you have the capacity for right now, what might be the short and long-term solutions, and start thinking about what barriers might need to be removed in order to make your plan happen. And then lastly, how are you going to hold yourselves accountable to that decision? So How are you going to, who's going to be responsible for it? Who's going to communicate and report out to those who are going to be impacted and keep people sort of informed about the process? And we're short on time, so I will give just a short description of the project where we used a racial equity analysis recently that we think is probably one of our most successful examples. And then if people want more detail, I'm happy to talk offline with people. But we did use a racial equity analysis in a planning decision with the Parks Division related to Bingham Park. And it actually reflected a deeper level of resident engagement and significantly changed the way that that decision was made. And we're actually going to see a difference in the way that playgrounds are made available in Bingham Park. And so for us, that was a really successful example. It was community-driven and community-led in multiple ways. And again, happy to talk about that more.
All right, so my name is Colleen Butler. I am with the YWCA in Madison, Wisconsin, and the mission of the YWCA is to eliminate racism and to empower women. We do that in Madison in 3 program areas. We have race and gender equity programming, we have housing and shelter, and we also have job training and transportation programming. We have approximately 65 staff at our organization, and we created this internal tool for ourselves to align our policies and practices with the mission of our organization. As Jordan mentioned earlier, many people have utilized the Race Forward racial equity tool, and that was the tool that we used to adapt to our own organization to do some analysis for our policies and practices internally. We recently have undergone a process where basically all of the directors at the organization led equity impact assessment processes on any policies that they are connected to in the organization. And just to go back to Jordan's point, for us, most of those were a review of existing policies. We really wanted to look at what we were doing already with that racial equity analysis and see where we might have some blind spots and where we might be not really living in alignment with our mission. So that was the purpose behind us going through this process. And now, now that we've done that and gone through most of our internal policies, we'll be kind of reviewing things every couple of years and also utilizing this policy analysis for upcoming policies and big decisions that we're making internally. Our tool uses 5 steps, and so what I was going to do is just walk you through the YWCA's process using a specific case study. So I'll just walk through the 5 different steps that we utilize, and I'm going to use the example of our scholarship policy to go through that. And some of the other places where we have utilized the racial equity impact assessment tool internally is on our employee handbook. We've gone through our entire hiring process, pretty much every step of that, including reviewing all of our job descriptions. Our resident handbooks, as I mentioned before, we do provide housing and shelter for women and families in Dane County. So all of our materials that we utilize for the people we serve, as well as our volunteer handbooks and orientations, and our scholarship policies for training and events. So we really tried to think of every potential place where we might need to take that racial equity analysis. So for us, the first step in our process is to record the decision, policy, or area that's being evaluated. We offer race and gender equity trainings in many different areas in our organization, and we wanted to ensure that our scholarship policy was creating kind of equitable access to those events and trainings. So that's the example I'm going to walk us through today. So step 2 for us is to involve stakeholders and evaluate who's at the table, asking ourselves the question of whether we have the full breadth of social identity groups and perspectives at the table, and do we seriously consider the input and perspectives of a broad range of group memberships. So for the example of our scholarship policy, we started by sending a survey to everybody who had received scholarships to YWCA trainings and events. We invited them all also to be part of our review process and focus group, and then we also invited staff and board who contribute to our training and events. So that was our first step, really trying to figure out who needs to be at the table and making sure that anybody who might be impacted by that policy had a chance to have a voice in that policy. Step 3, and again, you'll see this is very much in alignment with the process that Jordan kind of just walked through. For us, it's just, we have 5 steps, and so it's a little bit shorter, but it pretty much mirrors that same process. So you'll kind of recognize this language of determining the benefit or the burden. So how might unconscious attitudes be playing out in the decision or policy area? What could be the impact of this decision, policy, and making sure that we have people from a variety of perspectives at the table, and who might this decision, policy, or area disadvantage over others. So that's the kind of process that we use, and then walking you through the scholarship policy review that we did. These are actually the questions that we use on the electronic survey. So looking at how do you rank the ease of receiving scholarships from the YWCA, how did you feel during the process, how did you feel at the event? We were wanting to make sure that when people received scholarships to our events, they felt welcome and included and like a full participant at the event. How should we also asked them, because this is one of the questions we were really thinking about in terms of creating the scholarship policy, how should we prioritize people for scholarship opportunities? So we got feedback from folks on that. And then we asked some general questions about how did they learn about the opportunity to get the scholarships. So that was the process that we used, and then after we did the electronic survey, we also hosted a focus group to kind of go a little bit deeper with people and have a chance to really get their feedback on our draft policy, and kind of talk through any sticking points that people had and really get their feedback. So you can see the focus group questions. I'm not going to go through them all, but basically we're really trying to hear about what their experience was like working with us and partnering with us, what might need to be improved, and what went well. If we did something that went really well for people, we want to make sure that we include that for future possible participants. And then we got into the actual policy. So we gave them the draft policy and asked for their feedback in the current draft, if they could make changes, what might those changes look like, and what's their feedback about what we're proposing as a way to continue to try to provide equitable access to our programs. So moving on from that, so basically that step for us obviously is gathering the data and hearing from people about the policy, making sure we have those voices at the table. Now that we've collected all of that, heard all of that, we have to then ask ourselves the question, how do we make the decision more inclusive? What are our recommendations going to be to address any potential disparities with the policy, and what steps need to be taken to move that forward? So these were the recommendations that came out of that process from both the combination of the focus group and the survey. Basically, one of the main pieces that we heard back is that people really need to know that there are opportunities to get scholarships, that a lot of the people who do get scholarships to our events kind of came about it by happenstance. They either knew somebody who worked at the YWCA, or they found out about it and really wanted to come and they just decided to call. But we weren't doing a very good job of making sure that everybody actually knew that that was an opportunity. So that was one of the most important pieces that came out of those, is make sure that you actually state clearly that scholarships are available and let people know how they would go about getting them. I know that sounds really simple, but that was one of the main pieces that came back to us. They also suggested that we offer online scholarship application opportunities. They did advise us to be careful about how we do put that information out into the community. They recommended that one of the pieces that we had originally proposed is that we would have 5%, at least 5% of our registration slots would be held for people to receive a scholarship, and they wanted us to ensure that the language of that would be a minimum, because sometimes we're actually able to offer more scholarships than that, so just to be clear about that. And then they also said they wanted us to include language and opportunities for people who received scholarships to give back. A lot of people were actually really grateful for the opportunity to come to the trainings and would have liked to have done something to support those trainings in the future. And so we were really clear that it wouldn't be mandatory that you would have to do some sort of volunteering to get a scholarship, but we were going to create more clear paths for people to contribute to the organization and trainings if they were scholarship recipients. And then they suggested announcing at events, how many scholarships were given out, so people did know how many people were able to have access to the event that maybe were not able to pay the regular registration fees. So our final product for our scholarships, and I can share this in a different way so that we don't have to go through the whole thing, but basically we outlined how many scholarships slots we would hold for our smaller events and our larger events. We obviously put in our policy that we would clearly state in all of our registration materials that scholarships were available and how people would access them. Priority was given to people who state that without the scholarship they otherwise would have been unable to attend. That's a self-report type of thing, but that is the priority for people to receive our scholarships. If we needed to further prioritize scholarship opportunities, we were also looking at people who might contribute to the overall diversity of the event, people who are YWCA service recipients or volunteers, or people who had not yet received a scholarship from the YWCA in the current year. And then we did incorporate that people would be able to give back to the YWCA. So, so our final step in our process is evaluate, figure out who's going to be accountable for the process, figure out who, how are we going to make sure that we actually are having the outcomes and impacts that we are intending to have. And so for the scholarship policy, basically the first step of accountability for us was to share the policy back with the focus group and survey participants to get their approval and feedback on the end result. And then our second step was to keep tracking data on annual scholarship utilization, and the third step was that we're going to do a survey every 2 years regarding scholarship accessibility. So that's just one example. We utilize this 5-step process pretty much to go over every, like I said, policy that we have internally at the YWCA. And we thought it might be helpful to walk through it because I think sometimes when you see the tools, they can feel kind of overwhelming. So we were hoping to provide, one example of a way that it's been utilized in a nonprofit context to help people kind of see how that might play out. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Angela to share another example.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I just kind of wanted to chime in. If anybody has any questions, feel free to send them in. Looks like everybody's in sponge mode right now, kind of taking all the information in. So if anything comes up, feel free to send them along. Also, one thing I would like to mention, we have been getting some questions with regards to the slides being made available following the presentation. Yes, we will be doing that, as well as we are recording the webinar too. So we'll have that available on our website. So back to regular scheduled programming. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, my name is Angela Russell, and I am the Manager of Diversity and Inclusion at CUNA Mutual Group here in Madison, Wisconsin, and it is an honor and privilege to be on this webinar with my colleagues and friends, Jordan Bingham and Colleen Butler. Yay, Jordan, Colleen. So thanks for FCI for hosting us today. So I'm going to take a quick step back. In 2014, Bob Trunzo became the new CEO of CUNA Mutual Group, and one of the first things that he did within his first 6 months is added inclusion as one of our corporate values. And the reason that I'm saying that is because leadership commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important to organizations. And it's because of his leadership and commitment that we're able to do some of the stuff that we're doing as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion at CUNA Mutual Group. So there are 3 things that we're focused in on. We want to create a culture where all the employees can contribute, advance, and feel valued. We want to attract and retain a diverse workforce, and we want to hold all leaders and employees accountable to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in all teams. Another piece before I go into specifically of what we're doing, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of our overall corporate strategy, and that's also another key piece that is helping us propel and move things forward. So as part of our overall corporate strategy map, we have an objective to attract, retain, and develop a diverse workforce to meet the needs of our growing customer base across the country. So this is not just a nice to do at CUNA Mutual. It is a nice thing to do, it's the right thing to do, but it's also, we see it as a business imperative. So we're doing a variety of different things, and one of those things is focused in on what we call talent acquisition. That's the recruiting. Talent acquisition is the corporate word, as I've learned since I've been in the corporate sector, for recruiting. So, and my friends are laughing at me, which is great. To say it on a webinar too. So looking at recruiting, what we did is we wanted to understand how bias and unconscious bias plays into our recruiting process. So what we did is that before we actually started a process, we did a lot of education with our recruiting team. We've got a recruiting team of about 20 folks at CUNA Mutual, and we did a deep dive into what is equity, what is diversity, what is inclusion, and then did a deeper dive into what is implicit bias and what is explicit bias, and how does that affect who we hire. So we had a 2-hour training session, actually two separate training sessions on that for our recruiting team. And then after that, we went into a process of reviewing our entire recruitment process. And it's essentially a 5-page algorithm, and we went decision point by decision point and said, what does bias look like here, and what are the steps to mitigate against that bias? And this next slide kind of shows you what that looked like. So this is a picture of one page of the 5-page algorithm. And what I'm showing here is we had an intake meeting. So our recruiters meet with the person who's hiring, and they talk about the job description and what the hiring manager wants from that job, in that job. And so some of the things that would come up is that maybe the hiring manager only wants University of Minnesota grads. And that actually came up as part of our discussion. And the step to mitigate that is to be open to other schools. So we went through this entire process from the job description, the intake meeting, all the way through the background check to when people come in on board. And we know, and we found that there is bias at every step of the way. And so here are some of the example biases and mitigation strategies that came out of that. So one potential bias is that the hiring manager is focused on finding someone for the position just like the person who vacated it. That happens all the time. So our recommended mitigation strategy is that the recruiter, who's often a coach for the hiring manager in this process, encourages and pushes the manager to think more broadly. Another potential source of bias is only using one avenue to find candidates. And this is, so I'm relatively new to the corporate sector. It's been about a year. And I did not realize how heavily the corporate sector relies on LinkedIn for sourcing and finding candidates. So realizing that not all candidates may use LinkedIn, so finding other ways to identify candidates. So having open sourcing, online, offline, attend events, broaden your network of people that you know. Another one that happens not only at CUNA Mutual, but across the country, and the research shows it time and time again, avoiding to choose an interview candidate based on a name, and the recommended strategy is don't assume a certain race or gender based on name. So we know that folks with a ethnic sounding name are less likely to get an interview compared to white folks. So we don't want that kind of bias to hold us up. And then another potential bias that came up, particularly as it relates to phone interviews, is the person has an accent, which means are they difficult to understand? What does that mean for the work and blah, blah, blah. And our recommended strategy is to coach TA, and that means our talent acquisition team and hiring manager, that should not be a barrier to moving forward. So these are just several examples. We actually had a document of 11 pages of example biases and mitigation strategies going through that entire process, the swim lane document that I mentioned. So after that, I'm just going to go back to this other slide. We came up with several recommendations and then presented those recommendations to our HR leadership team. And one of those recommendations is to provide a tool, like a one-page priming resource for all hiring managers so that they can understand what is bias and understand their role for reducing the role of bias in the recruitment process. We just had a meeting on that yesterday at CUNA Mutual, and one of the other strategies that we're going to recommend is a 10 to 15 minute video that goes along with the one-pager for everyone who hires. Also, providing coaching and training a little bit more in-depth for our recruiters so they can feel empowered to work with the hiring manager to provide specific strategies and coaching on reducing bias. Also, looking at how our job descriptions are written. There's been a lot of research out there recently about gender in job descriptions, that there are certain roles that trigger male-sounding job descriptions versus female, and what that means at an unconscious level for who applies, who decides to apply, who doesn't, and who the hiring manager is more likely to like versus not. Also, related to job descriptions, it's an interesting thing of, particularly in Madison, we love all of the good degrees, all of them, like master's, doctor, we love all the degrees. But it's really trying to figure out, do we actually need a degree for this position? Or looking at what are the actual skills and competencies necessary for the position that we're hiring for. And then being really careful in our selection process. When you have an interview panel team, making sure that they know what bias is and they understand it, and that they can really have good conversation if bias is occurring in the process, and then looking at where we are trying to find candidates. So that's a little bit of what we've done at CUNA Mutual, and it's really using an intentional process to uncover bias in a very specific area of recruiting. And that, again, is only one piece of the puzzle that we're doing, but that is what we're doing on that. So I think we're all available for questions at this point, Jordan, Colleen, and I.
Sure, sure. So great. Well, thank you, ladies, for that. I have been monitoring some of the questions that we've been getting in, so there's a couple that are coming in throughout the presentation. If you do have more, feel free to send them via using the chat box or the questions box. But right now, one of the questions that came through would be for Angela with regards to the bias training that you spoke of. Did you bring an outside trainer for that, or was that done by someone in-house?
That was done by me, so I'm in-house. But there are a number of outside trainers that could be used as well. In addition, there are a lot of great videos that are out there on YouTube. There's one by Verna Myers in terms of understanding our own unconscious bias. That's a TED Talk. It's on YouTube as well. There's one from the Royal Society in the UK called Understanding Unconscious Bias, and it's a 3-minute video, and that's one that we use a lot, and several other TED Talks that can be used to integrate training into your training.
Sure, sure. And we will make some of those videos that Angela had mentioned available with links on our website, along with some of the other resources that were mentioned. Let's see here. Angela, could you give an example of a genderized job skill?
It's not, yes. So when we talk about results-driven, that has been shown to sound more male and lean more male. So making sure that when we're saying, what are we looking for when we're looking at that results-driven language, and is there a way to change the language so it's not as male sounding? Or the other thing that the research suggests is making sure that there's a balance between male sounding words and female sounding words. And then this is what's been also fascinating for me is the number of tools and apps and IT solutions that are out there that can be used to scan job descriptions and look for words of bias type words. Those are out there. If you just do a Google on it, you can find them, and they cost a lot of money. But
a worthwhile resource for sure. Here's a question that I'm sure will spark some conversation here. How do you deal with internal pushback with some of these items? Have you experienced that? What tools or practices have you used to kind of combat that? So I'll turn it over.
So I think, this is Colleen, and I would say that this kind of goes back to where Angela started her presentation, which has to do with leadership buy-in. it's not that you can't utilize these strategies without leadership buy-in, but if you have leadership buy-in and it's coming from places in the organization where people are saying this is really important, this is how we're going to do business, it makes it a lot easier, and the pushback becomes a little bit more challenging because people are hearing from the top that this is how we're going to be doing business going forward. That said, I think things you can do to make it easier are just making sure that you understand that as you're implementing these types of procedures that people understand why, they understand how it's connected to your mission, your vision, your values, so you tie it into things that are in place that everybody is expected to both understand and support in your organization. And we haven't, I don't know that we've explicitly said this, but you've kind of heard all of us mention it, doing trainings, not just about using tools, but trainings that help people understand why these tools are critical, I think will help move people along. But I think leadership buy-in is probably one of the most critical components to dealing with potential internal pushback.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This is Jordan. The only thing I would add is if you are experiencing pushback, just to try to understand more about it, where it's coming from and what might be beneath it, because I think pushback can take a few different forms or can be driven by a few different things. It might be that people already feel like they're maxed out and too busy, and this might seem like an extra layer of work. And so, the sort of the solution or the response to that would be to help people feel involved in, or help people understand how this can make them better at their jobs, frankly. We can all be more effective and thus more efficient. And a quick example I can think of that is we did some early work with the City of Madison Clerk's Office, and they're the busiest people I've ever met in my life. And I'll say that they actually took some time to not only start using racial equity tools, but they analyzed their entire 2-year work plan, and were looking for ways to specifically incorporate and center racial equity into their work. And what they found was it helps them to be more efficient because they had a better shared sense of what their priorities were. And they were able to drive some of their work around that. That might not be the opposition that's coming from everybody. Some might not quite see the value of centering race in decisions, and I think that can be a tougher one. That I think requires a little bit of a longer-term approach and shared learning on, where did racialized inequities come from? Why is it all of our responsibility to work to undo those? And so just that continues, as Colleen said, training and creating a learning environment. And I think regardless of what the pushback is, I think we as, we understand the adult brain to, that if people don't feel a part of something, or they don't feel included, or they don't see themselves reflected in being part of this work, it's going to be hard for people to buy in. So I would just encourage people to get a little more curious and try to understand where that pushback is coming from.
The only other thing that I would add is I would expect it. It's part of the process, and I wouldn't say that you should stop doing what you're doing because you're getting pushback. It's absolutely part of it. And I've had colleagues tell me that if you don't get pushback, you should question your strategy, because that means that you may not be pushing far enough.
That's right.
That's yes. And the other thing that, and Jordan and I used to work together, the other thing that we would do strategically is figure out who's the right communicator, and use who's the right communication vehicle. I am a woman of color, and certain things will be heard differently because I am a woman of color. And that's not to say that people are bad. That's just the way that our brains are wired in terms of our own unconscious bias. So making sure that you've got the right messenger at the right time is also helpful in terms of addressing pushback.
Great. Some good tools. Couple more questions. We've got some time, so we'll go ahead with this. Another group question. How does this analysis apply to small nonprofits in terms of logistics necessary to apply equity tools effectively across the organization?
I mean, to me, the size of the organization, it shouldn't be a deterrent for using the tools. The tools are really just, like Jordan said earlier, kind of an intentional pause where you look at decisions and policies within your current context and think about how you are potentially exacerbating bias or minimizing that. And so to me, I feel like any organization can utilize the tools. It's just going to be the scale at which you utilize them. And frankly, we at our organization did have leadership change, which led to us doing all this analysis, and that was a wonderful thing, and it's really great to have leadership buy-in, but we did too much in too short a period of time. So I would say if you're small and maybe over capacity in general, just being comfortable doing one thing at a time, not feeling like you have to do every single strategy all in 1 year, but maybe just picking one thing that's like maybe the thing that you feel like you have that either has the most impact over your work or that's the most malleable, and starting with that. And then, just doing one thing at a time, because I think sometimes when you get into this work, there's like you feel like you need to do everything all at once because everything feels really urgent, and that's true, but it also can burn people out. So if you have a smaller staff, I would just, pick one thing to focus on and see what you can do with a smaller example to start.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Do you guys have any advice for recruiting or hiring for smaller organizations that don't have the tools or resources to pay for consulting or an in-depth review?
Yeah, this is Angela. I think one of the things I say often at CUNY Mutual is that hiring is so much about who you know. So going out and developing intentional relationships is huge. So if your circle and your network looks just like you, that's a problem. So really going out and making connections out in the community will be incredibly beneficial. Do something once a month that is not as something that's a part of your normal day-to-day thing, and just get to know folks different than yourself.
And I would just add that, I've been at the YWCA since we were a staff of 20 some odd people, and we do most of our we don't have an HR department, we don't have consultants come in to work with us on these kind of processes. We've done, it's been pretty homegrown effort for us. And one of the first things that we did in our process was we did start with our hiring tools, and really thinking about where can you post your jobs that maybe will expand your audience. And so one of the first things we did is we created a really expansive spreadsheet of every community listserv that we could find in town, and really thinking about free places where you can spread the news. So if you're in this community, there are listservs like La Soup and Communities United, the Youth Resource Network, which will help get your job postings out to a wide variety of people and let people know that you're interested in hearing from a wide variety of different kinds of job applicants. So those are some free things that you can do that don't take a huge amount of extra effort, but it can actually really change the results of your hiring.
Great. And there was a question that came in about the free postings that you had just mentioned and getting a list, and I'll reach out to you, and we'll have those available as well. One last question, we'll go around and ask, why isn't race equity more prominent in budget decisions? What are your feelings with that? I know that's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah,
but
I can't speak for, I think that there's probably a huge variety of reasons. But I think inertia might be the biggest answer to that, is that we've gotten so used to doing things a certain way, and we've created efficiencies that work really well for our system the way it's built. And to take a huge step back and build in a racial equity analysis or lens to that process is, feels like it could feel like blowing something up and starting from scratch. And there just might be a reluctance out of not knowing where to start or not knowing what that would look like. And so, it might take some training. It might take finding other organizations that have done it before. And I can speak to what the City of Madison is doing right now and looking at taking an outcome-based budgeting approach that they're rolling into in 2017. And we're looking now and working with the finance department, how do we set or align our racial equity priorities with the ways that all city departments create their budgets, and what would that look like, and how will success be measured? And I think it takes a long-term approach. So I don't know if the two of you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's that in terms of inertia, but I also think it's a lack of understanding of our own history and how what we're seeing today, and in terms of disparities and our current practices, is a result of centuries worth of oppression. And I think that when we understand that, it makes it much more of an imperative that we do something. I know a tool that each of us uses is a video called The Race, the Power of an Illusion, and that we've shown part 3 of that episode at CUNA Mutual a lot. It's called The House We Live In, and that has really opened people's eyes about how a lot of the stuff that we see has been a result of public policy that folks didn't even know, and it causes this like emotional reaction of, wow, we've got to change this, and what can we do to change? I think it's something that Jordan taught me about connecting the head, heart, and hands in all of this. And so once we understand how we got here, in knowing that it's really kind of appalling in some situations, but also realizing that we can and can make a difference, and we should make a difference.
And the only thing that I would add is it's just when we start to do these processes and we actually are being effective at bringing people in and engaging people, there's 2 steps to that process. One is listening and the other is doing. And so when we're talking about budgeting and we're engaging people, we must, at that point, actually do what they tell us to do. Like, we cannot ask the questions and then not do what they are advising us to do. And so I think that that's actually a big barrier when it comes to budgeting and really thinking about it, is we oftentimes are going to people to get approval on decisions that have already been made, which is actually really hurting our ability to do effective community engagement. And we really should be going to people as part of the budgeting process, and we have to be, and to do that, we have to be willing to like really change how we're allocating resources and really listening to what people need in the community. And so I think that that is a really critical piece to consider when you're doing these types of processes. It's not just asking the question and hearing the answers, but it's actually doing something differently once you hear those answers.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're just a little bit over time. We want to be respectful of everybody's time, and thanks so much for everyone's interaction with questions throughout and participating in the poll. Please join me in thanking Jordan, Colleen, and Angela for their support and outstanding presentation, as well as BMO Harris Bank for their support. As with all of our webinars, the recording will be available for playback on our website. We will be sending out a follow-up message to all attendees with links to more resources from the presentation and the aforementioned link to the recording of the presentation. I would encourage all participants to review our website at forwardci.org for more information on how forward community investments might help your organization. Our next installment of our webinar series will take place on Tuesday, May 31st. We're excited to have students from the UW-Madison's Odyssey Project with Kevin G. Mullen, Assistant Director of the University of Wisconsin's Madison's Odyssey Project, present a webinar entitled Behind the Numbers, Stories of Inequity in Wisconsin. 5 students will present their personal stories of how racial inequity has touched their lives, and we will consider how their personal stories connect to systems level and other barriers and explore opportunities to remove these. We invite you to register for this webinar on our website. We will also include a link to where you can register for that webinar in the follow-up message that we will send. One final note, when you close your browser from this session, you will be directed to a very concise questionnaire to evaluate today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to complete to help us continue to improve the effectiveness of these offerings. Thanks again to BMO Harris Bank for making this exceptional learning opportunity available, and keep doing good.